Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you joining us on Zoom or whatever platform we're on, we're glad to have you as well. My name is Carol Shaw, and I am from Virginia Commonwealth University. And I am here with my colleague and bestie at work, Lauren Avalone. We're here to talk today about some research we're doing with respect to identifying quality indicators of supported employment for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Um, the folks in the Zoom audience, feel free to chat your questions. And in this audience, we will leave time at the end. Because of the unique feature that we're being broadcast live, I think it might be best if we save questions to the end. So moving forward, we started this research because we wanted to know, oops, let me see, let me get Max, love them as much as you can. So we wanted to know more about what's happening in the field with respect to supported employment. VCU has been for a long time doing research around the provision of supported employment, and we particularly are interested in the second bullet. How do we address the research to practice gap that we see in the acquisition of competitive integrated employment for people with IDD? The way we're going to go over our findings from a national focus group studying the quality indicators of supported employment, and then we have time at the end to discuss those. Okay, so that's our overview going forward. So, yes, Lauren. Oh, you're good. Yes.
It'd be weird. Just a quick clarification that if you do have questions, to put them in the Q&A and not the chat. And also a very special thanks to Christopher Claude, who is not joined in person with us today, but he was a substantial contributor to this presentation today.
Thank you so much. And I'm also going to give Whitney Ham also a shout out, who is a very substantial part of this research that we're completing. Okay, so on the screen before you, I'm not going to read this. It's a lot of words, but it is the actual definition of supported employment according to the Rehabilitation Services Administration, or RSA. And if you look at this definition, by the end of it, if you're reading it, by the end of it, you probably still don't know what supported employment is. And in fact, RSA has another whole definition of what supported employment services are. And yet again, I'm not going to read this, a lot of words on the screen, but if you get to the end of this one, what you will notice is they use the term supported employment to describe employment where people need support. They're describing, and you know, I know these laws, these regulations are written in lawyerese, but what I'm really conveying here is that if you're relying upon regulation to define what supported employment is, you're going to struggle because they're using the term supported employment to describe supported employment, and they're actually using supported employment as both a noun and as the verb that defines the noun. So supported employment is employment where people need support, is basically what all of those words say. And so at the end of the day, you don't know what supported employment is if that's what you're relying upon. To make this point about why are we doing this research, well, we want to really understand how to help people, especially job seekers with intellectual and developmental disabilities, gain competitive integrated employment. And what we find is a tremendous research to practice gap. So on the left side of the screen, you'll see it says in research, we really define this as a four-phase model. We start with a strengths-based job seeker profile. We then move into a phase called job development. Then we engage in job site training. Job development is actually finding and getting employment. Then we move into job site training. How do you do that job once you're there? And then finally, supported employment, as it was originally developed, included a long-term supports and services phase. We also developed this, and we're lucky to work with Paul Wayman, who kind of really started supported employment way back in the late 70s, early 80s. Um, the one employment specialist or job coach, that it is one employment specialist that follows the person all the way through. In research, we see that people who receive supported employment, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, gain employment within about 5 to 8 months, earn more money, work more hours, and in research, about 73 to 90% of individuals with IDD gain employment as a result of SE, supported employment. In practice, though, we see a very different picture. We see a wide variety of models. Some agencies, some states even, employ a multiple service provision model where there's one person who finds the job, there's another person who trains the person to do the job, there might be a third person who does the assessment and intake, there might be a fourth person who does the follow along. And so there's all of this handing off of the case. We also see that there's a wide variety of assessment practices that occur. Some states require that you do so many scales or so many employment, and states even define by hours. How many hours do you actually engage in assessment versus job development? That might be limited state to state. Finally, those four phases that I talked about in research that are a part of the originally developed model are actually considered in the Rehabilitation Services Administration regulation as adjunctive services. Like they're not required. Like supported employment, you don't have to do job site training. When in fact, the original model was, yep, you got to do job site training. What we see in practice then, and this is where the research to practice gap really becomes very apparent, is that according to RSA, people who with IDD who receive supported employment gain employment within between 20 to 25 months. It's quite a big difference from 5 to 8 months. And those job seekers with IDD are gaining employment between 34 to 37% of the time. And so that really defines the research to practice gap. The blue line is the research. What we see in research happens with supported employment, and I guess on the screen it kind of looks orangish, brownish line. That's practice, what we see. And it is that gap that we wanted to know about. Can we move that needle? Can we bring practice closer to research? Can we bring down the amount of time to employment for job seekers with IDD? Can we bring up the employment rate for job seekers with IDD? And so it was that we really wanted to know about. And so we want to define what are the quality indicators of SE so that we could build a fidelity scale that looks at what should you be doing when you're doing supported employment? How do we then train community rehabilitation providers to implement high fidelity supported employment? And so that's really the purpose of the research that we're undertaking. And we're at an early phase of the research where we're beginning with focus groups, and that's what we're going to describe this afternoon. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lauren, who will take us through the purpose of the study, and then we'll look at the results.
So as Carol mentioned, the purpose of this study was really to develop a fidelity scale. And we wanted to begin by gathering information from those who are really in the know. We wanted to look not only at what is important supported employment practices, but also what's the difference between supported employment and quality supported employment. We really want a high bar for this service. So we started with service providers. Naturally, that's where one would begin. And we wanted a national sample so that we could tap into some of the state or regional nuances that would impact quality of services. The criteria for participation in this study for service providers was currently working in for an employment service agency, Having used supported employment to assist clients gain competitive integrated employment, and we were looking specifically at clients with intellectual and developmental disabilities. For this particular study, we restricted the age to 18, which is not surprising given the criteria of service provider. Um, Excuse me as I learn to work a Mac in real time. Uh, Not well, not doing it, not well. Carol's gonna help me here. Um, I just did that. She's so much better at this. Okay. She might need to come up here and assist me again. This is not my forte. But some of the reasons that we decided to choose a focus group over a survey or some other methods is that we really wanted to tap into the benefits of the focus group model. It really allows for a rich discussion among participants. It also helps provoke others' thoughts about ideas they may not have otherwise contributed solo. It also gives opportunities to share personal experiences, which we can glean a lot of insight from those. And it also allows for information that goes beyond personal experiences into some of that technical, those technical skill sets that are really necessary for quality outcomes. And then it also really embraces diversity of perspectives. And so we wanted this culmination of ideas that had, again, really rich, in depth information. So the guiding research question, which is up here, is what components of supported employment are most effective in achieving competitive integrated employment outcomes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? That's a mouthful, but at its core, that is what we're looking at. So quality CIE outcomes for people with IDD. What parts of supported employment lend itself to these outcomes? And so to do this, we embarked upon a recruitment effort in August of 2024. That's approximately 9 months ago now. And we used the APSE, the Association for People Supporting Employment First, their newsletter, in order to get participants. And I don't know how to work this. I'm not good at this, everyone. I apologize in advance.
Do you want to go down?
You do that.
I don't know. I don't know how to tell you. Keep your fingers apart. Put them. Yeah, there you go.
Are you pressing or no?
No, no pressing.
Oh, that's my issue.
Just sliding. Just
Okay.
sliding.
Um, if you join next year, if there is a next year, I will know how to do this better. So we offered, probably not, that's true. That is very fair. So we offered 5 focus groups that were 90 minutes each and an option for up to 10 people to participate in each. We conducted these virtually. Again, we wanted a national sample, so that was the best way to do that. And then we also wanted to create anonymity for participants, both to get honesty and positive and negative feedback. To do that, we encouraged participants to have their cameras off during the focus groups. We also had them change their name on their profile to an ID number so they wouldn't be recognizable. And then we didn't ask any identifiable information during the focus group. Instead, we issued a red cap link to a demographic survey that they would then fill out anonymously afterwards. And so we had aggregated demographic information. The semi-structured format, I did it. It worked. Was meant to encourage discussion. We wanted to capture all aspects of support employment from the very beginning all the way to the end. So that meant from the time a person was supporting a job seeker and looking or thinking about employment, all the way to the end where they'd secured a position and were looking at long-term job retention and then also upward mobility. So we constructed approximately 10 questions that really targeted, again, those basic ideas from start to finish. Rather than read each individual question, I'll just give you a summary of one of the, of what some of that content was. So we asked about their current work, some of the processes they use for information gathering, what determinants they use to determine determinants of when to start looking for a job with a client. We also wanted to know how they helped a person find CIE, how they might interact with businesses that they found was particularly effective. We also wanted to know how they provided support through hiring, so that onboarding process, and then also on the job training. We asked them about what was necessary for long term support And then broadly, we asked them what did they feel were the essential components of supported employment. I'm going to talk a little bit about who the sample was that participated in our focus groups. We had a total of 19 participants. We did have all of our slots fill up, but as with research, not everyone showed up as they said they might. But 19 is not a bad turnout. It was more than enough in terms of qualitative research when you're pouring through transcripts. There was plenty of content. We had mostly female participants at about 87%, mostly white at 88%. And then we had a fairly equal distribution of age across the participants. About 28% were between 31 and 40 years of age, 33 between 41 and 50%, another 28 between 51 and 60%, between 51 and 60 years of age, excuse me. And we did have a few participants that were between the ages of 61 and 70. So we had a kind of a nice range of age there. And then the average time individuals in our focus group had been in their current position was almost 9 years. So I'll go over just a little bit about who these individuals were. We have a couple demographic slides to help illustrate that. The first one is looking at the current position and the type of agency that they worked at. So the largest single category for employment was it employment services, um, manager or supervisor. But we also had some employment specialists, some direct support staff, and some managers. And then about 21% indicated other. So that included, in the demographics, we provided an opportunity for clarification. So that category comprised career consultant CEO, a program founder, and then also an admissions coordinator. And then with reference to agency type, most were, as you can tell, overwhelmingly on this graph were community rehabilitation providers or ESOs at almost 80%. And then that 21% here for other regarding type of agency, we had reported state agency, day activity and community supports, a private provider, and one person was a customized employment provider. So overall, the demographics in this aren't that surprising. Again, we were pretty restrictive in the criteria for participating, so this was generally what we were expecting in terms of who would turn out. But it is nice to see some of the differing levels in terms of the positions because those individuals are going to have different perspectives. I'll do just a quick drive by here on some of these other demographics. Interestingly, with the education, um, the entire sample that we had some level of advanced training. Around 30% had either a master's or a bachelor's, around 20% with associates, and about 16% had some college. And then in terms of the primary service provided over there on the right, um, again, not surprisingly, about 90% support employment. And then we did have one person who was, as I just mentioned, a customized employment provider. That gets a little confusing, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Customized employment is housed under the definition of supported employment in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And so this person signed up along with this. And so again, we have a little bit of overlap there in terms of how people are perceiving whether or not they're providing supported versus customized and how that really all works and blends together. The participant demographics in terms of number of work week involved, we wanted to see, okay, if you're participating and giving us information, how directly involved are you in the outcomes, the employment outcomes of these individuals? What we found here is that, and this is a little confusing in terms of the percent. So it's the percent of the week and then the percent of the sample underneath it. So if you followed me there, percent weekly hours on the left is directly supporting one in getting CIE. So this doesn't mean direct support staff. It just means that they're directly involved in some way in that process. So over half of our sample reported somewhere between 50 and 100% of their time. And we already discussed the age, so I won't take up time doing that here. But moving along to data analysis. So we wanted to do this focus group. We did the focus group. Now we have the data. What did we do with it? We used thematic analysis and we used a standard 6-step model to thematic analysis. I don't know how name, I believe is how you pronounce that. Sorry if you are out there and never see this, and I mispronounced it, but we followed their 6-step model. And as you can see here, those are the 6 steps. I will just give you more of a summary of what those steps look like together. So, with this model, the first step is really reading through all of the transcripts. That's the familiarization of data. You get kind of an aerial perspective of what information you have. Then you move to combing through that data. So we went through each transcript individually in order to locate common words and phrases that related to our research question. Then we used that information to establish a code book. Then we thoroughly combed through each transcript again and applied that code book. We wanted to establish iterator reliability, so we had at least 2 researchers on each transcript. And where there might be dissent about which code to apply to certain content, we had a discussion until we reached consensus. Through that process, we developed themes. So that involves reviewing coded segments, extracting similar patterns, constructs, trends, and all of that finally culminates in the creation eventually of a conceptual model. Carol mentioned earlier that we are in the initial phases of this. We are only representing service providers here. To have a meaningful and thorough model, we definitely need to have a variety of other stakeholders. So later in this presentation, we'll just briefly go over kind of our preliminary conceptual model. So after we went through our thematic data analysis, what we found is that there were 6 major themes that emerged. And those are job seeker profile, job development, job site training, and long-term support, along with 2 additional kind of, I would say, unique and more varied than the first 4. And we'll go into detail about each of these in a minute. Those are quality indicators across phases, and then some modifiable influencers that we can really target in order to bolster quality support and employment services. So I'm going to turn this back over to Carol, and she's going to begin to go through the first 4 of these.
We present a lot together, and we're usually very much more like next to each other and looking goofy. And so we're trying to manage this transition well. Hopefully, it's coming across well in Zoom land. Okay, so the job seeker profile. One of the things that I think really stands out, and I think it's important to note that there are other fidelity measures out there, and some agencies have fidelity measures, but we feel like for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's really important to talk about this because we're not talking about people who have, generally speaking, previous work experience. We're talking about folks, generally speaking, who are naive to the world of work. And so as we begin to look at this profile, for a lot of times, these are not folks who come in with a very clearly developed considered, well thought out job goal. These are folks who come in who might not know what their strengths and interests are. And so we heard that from these focus groups that at the minute you meet the person, the individuals who are providing support are beginning to develop this job seeker profile. And that moving to job development happens once a job goal occurs, once you have enough information about the person, and keeping in mind that some of these folks are not particularly effective at using words to communicate well. And so these are not folks who come in with, like, I want to be I'll go with the SpongeBob metaphor. I want to be a fry cook, and that's not what's happening here. And so not only does assessment start from the very first moment that you meet the individual, the goal of assessment is to develop that job goal, but assessment continues across the entire process. Because at that point, once you've identified the job goal, then you've really got to get a sense of how am I going to help how am I going to help this person interview? How am I going to help this person access employment once they get a job? How are they going to learn their job tasks? And so that assessment process continues throughout. And so the how of this assessment happens through intake, interviews, record review, and work trials. One of the things that came out of the data is not to rely on scales. And this is different with some other populations where scales like the ONET or some of those other free scales online might be really helpful. With this population, most of our providers said scales are not helpful. Scales are not reliable for this group. Um, the WHO was wider with this group as well. Instead of just working with the job seeker, there were many providers who talked about, well, yeah, we have to involve the family in a much more meaningful way, and we have to plan for the support of that family. And then the what do you assess really is that last line, person-centered strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. And for a lot of the folks the providers, the employment specialists, the employment support organizations, as they talked about this group, what they really identified was that this is a group that a lot of times is coming in younger for services, is coming in out of high school. And so a lot of times these are folks who don't have a sense of what am I good at? What do I really prefer when it comes to work? What am I interested in doing and what are my needs? And so it becomes really important. Just to give you a couple of quotes, and again, I'm not going to read through these because it's a little difficult to read through quotes, but the first quote really was about the involvement of family in this assessment period, in this profile period. The idea that if it looks like it's going to take a long time, or if you're engaging in stuff that doesn't directly relate to finding that job, um, the family doesn't want you to waste their child, their individuals, their brother, their sister, et cetera, time. And so it's really important to engage families a lot of times in this early process, but also to keep in mind that we need to have that be goal oriented toward employment. Um, in fact, this quote arose in relation to talking about scales. And this provider said, yeah, we used to use scales, but we noticed that family members are like, you're wasting my child's time. What are you going to get from this scale? Right? Another issue that they brought up was really understanding the job seeker's goal, and that this was a process of ascertainment, that you really have to work to understand what the person is seeking. At the end of this quote, this person said, within our agency, we call it ABC. A, any job, B, better job, C, career job. And that really helped frame job development. And so, are we looking for any job? Are we looking for a better job or a career? And understanding that for this group of participants was really an important aspect of the work. Next, our participants really talked about job development. And here, what you begin to see is what we talk about as the dual skill sets that supported employment providers need. And that is understanding how to interact with a person with IDD while also understanding how businesses work and how to speak a business language. And so there is this dual set of skills. Um, we wanted to know, when does job development start? Because in a lot of models, like the IPS model, it is rapid. Like within 2 hours, you are looking for a job. But here, it really is dependent upon the development of that job goal. And most providers talked about the need for a job development plan and really identifying, what are we working on. Some providers even said, you might go in with a job goal that you think is the job goal. You get the person into a job and then you find out didn't quite make it. We really need to retailor or re-engineer what the job is, or help this person find another job, because what we thought we were working toward didn't really work out. And so you see that job development plan and that assessment process continues throughout. There was also a lot of discussion about interacting with businesses. And that was, how does the job coach or the employment support agency interact with the business? How does the job seeker interact with the business? And what does that employment support provider take when they're examining the business culture? All of this work with the business and around the business pointed to job match. for this particular group, job match is a critical piece. It's not just, I got you a job in an area where you want, but is my employer flexible? Will my employer allow me to have my own picture sequences up to help me learn skill sets? Or is the workforce that I'm working with willing to include me in the culture of the business? I mean, we've seen examples of people with IDD who get jobs and then get bullied at work. You know, just because adults are working doesn't mean there aren't bullies within that group. We also saw a lot of discussion about support through hiring, but also in that hiring process, both making the business case for supported employment, helping the employer understand what's this extra person going to be doing, but then also expectation setting for the business. And I think we have some quotes in here who that really talk about that. And the first was the expectation of the business for the employee. And that was that this is not a charity, that I'm here to help, but this is your employee. And so what was really critical here was the employment specialists really talked about walking a line that I'm standing alongside the support manager and I am training the individual to do the job and the support manager to interact with their employee. That there is a process, and this person described it at the end. A part of the hiring process is understanding the expectations, that this is not a charity, that this person is here to work. Then there was this whole discussion about making the business case, a number of different folks. And remember, this was across 5 different focus groups that we held. We heard this theme again and again and again. Where the employer, and I love this quote because it really gets there, the employer starts to realize the magnitude and the power of this untapped labor pool. And the business realizes giving a person with a disability a job is not a favor. It's about helping the employer, listening to them, figuring out where they are, and telling them you can have an edge. You are putting your finger on the pulse of this untapped pool. This is, I think, a really important point because talk to any employer and they're going to talk about how difficult it is to keep their staff. And a lot of people talked about supported employment, that the angle that we should look at this through is workforce development. We are not asking for charity. We are not asking for, hire somebody out of the goodness of your heart. We know you need good workers. We have an untapped talent pool that you haven't begun to experience. We need to bring you together as workforce development. So then we looked at job site training. So the person has been hired, they're on the job, they're onboarded, you know, cliche term that everybody uses these days. Then the focus became about what are all the skills that you teach and how do you go about teaching that? And again, we see there's a real focus on job skills, on professionalism skills, on building independence. But also, again, you'll see this is also about the employer. Employers don't come to hiring someone knowing how to communicate well with someone who maybe uses an augmentative or alternative communication device, or someone who maybe uses a picture system, or someone who relies upon echolalia to communicate well. And so making sure that the employer gains skills at the same time that you're supporting the individual. There was also a real focus on fading the moment you start, fading from direct support. How do I back out? How do I do this? And then finally, there were numerous systematic strategies that folks used, like task analysis. Some folks even referenced discrete trial to learn terminology and skills like that, although that was less used. So I have a couple of quotes here, and again, not going into too much detail and not reading them to you, but from the very beginning of job training, the job coaches, the employment specialists that we talked to said they have a tendency to ask me questions because I'm the one that's been helping them get to this point. but I continually redirect them to their employer, to their supervisor, to their coworker. And I'm also continually reminding the employer, how do you check in? So when do I ask? How do I ask? All of those kinds of skills are very important. They also talked about employment service provider skills, that what it takes to be an employment specialist is an incredible amount of initiative and being creative. And I think this got to the idea of these two sets of skills. A lot of people enter supported employment as their career because they want to work with people with disabilities. They stay because they find it endlessly creative, and they love the work, not just with the people, but matching people to jobs and figuring out how to make jobs work and how to meet employer needs. So in essence, the employment specialist has two clients, the business and the individual. The final area that we explored, how are we doing on time? We're good. Cool. The final area that we explored was long-term support. And this area is an area that is not well described and not well funded across states. Some states have funding for long-term support, others don't. And some of what you're going to see is that there is a need for this population for regular check-ins. After the person is employed, is successfully employed, is stable, is able to work at least 80% or more of their job independently, then that's when long-term support becomes important. And so it's really important that the employment specialist has a focus on, how do I keep my relationship with this business? How do I ensure that this business is going to tell me when they need me? And then how do I focus on natural supports? Who's in this business that's going to continue to help and tell me the truth? And then finally, we were really also interested in upward mobility. And so regular check-ins, there was somebody who said, I just had a case closure yesterday, and I told my guy, hey, if something comes up, you don't understand, you get confused, text me, call me, beep me, whatever works for you, get in touch with me, so that you don't feel like you're alone out there. In terms of the good business relationship, again, the next quote really focuses in on that it's one of the most important parts of the process, is to keep that relationship. People talked about how, if you don't have that relationship, you call the business, you check in and you say, how is everything? And they say, oh, it's great, it's okay, it's great, it's good, it's great, fine. We're firing him tomorrow. And in order to stop that from occurring, you have to have that business relationship. You have to have a job coach that's checking in with the supervisor and not just the employee. So again, you see that dual role. The next quote, I think, is a really, really important one, because it talks about this notion for people with IDD that we should and we need to be looking at upward mobility. And so I'm going to take just a minute of your time to read through this quote, because I think it's important. I'll read from my screen so I don't look weird in Zoom land. Um, People talk about how, oh, such and such, the name of a person, they were there 20 years, but they're doing the same job for 20 years. How about we do performance reviews? How about we let the employer know, hey, they can do this. What things can we add or integrate into what they're doing? We had a young lady that started in the back prepping, and she ended up working her way all the way through to where she's a shift manager. Now, that took investing in communication with that employer of how to teach and how to reach. And she did. And she was able to move up. So, this idea of upward mobility becomes really essential for this population, because it doesn't happen. We have to mindfully work to make it happen, and we don't get to that without long-term supports and services. I'm going to turn it back to Lauren, who's going to wrap us up with those indicators that cut across all of these phases. Because let me just say one thing. What we've done is we've looked at each of these individual phases as if they're discrete, but there are things that cut across these phases. You're up. I'll go this way this time.
Carol stole my lead into the slide, but that's okay. So far, we've really talked about the kind of sequential steps, the segregated steps of support employment. And that is really how we often think and talk about this. But I think anyone in this field, all of you sitting here, certainly can say that in practice, it doesn't really work like that. There is a lot of overlap, and it's probably time we recognize and talk about that a little more. So, one of the themes that we really honed in on here is what are some of the indicators that cut across or cut through those four steps that Carol just went into? Um, so, some of what how to do this. Some of those that we really identified based on the feedback from our service providers and the focus groups is that that person-focused approach, it's often talked about in the assessment part at the beginning, but that really needs to continue all the way through. And that we also need to keep in mind that this was designed originally, support employment, for individuals with the most significant support needs. So we're really looking at people who have complex support needs, and that's drifted, I think, in a lot of arenas to individuals that maybe don't need that level of support. So we want to be more mindful all the way through that that's who's receiving these services. We also want to keep in mind that strength-based approach. A lot of the individuals we work with who have IDD, they have unfortunate history of being told a lot of what they can't do rather than what they can do. We want to be reframing that at each point during those four steps. Yes, that includes the assessment process and also in terms of what jobs they might be eligible for. But to Carol's point, that includes upward mobility. Individuals with IDD grow the same way all of us do on the job. And so we want to be mindful that we're giving them those opportunities and focusing on the skills they've developed and what they can do over time. The networking with businesses, and this is just a summary really of what these bullet points are up here. But the networking with businesses is really an ongoing process. Certainly, you'll be doing that in phase two when you're job developing, but to have good relationships with businesses and have potential opportunities with businesses, we really need to be networking all the time. We need to be leveraging our social capital and be continuously making relationships with the individuals in a position to help employ the clients that we work with. And also keeping in mind through the whole process that this is a multi-focus support. We're providing support to the client, of course, but also families are a big part that gets left out of the conversation. How can they be better involved in each step along the way? That can go for educators, it can also mean businesses all the way through. That might look somewhat different from client to client, but again, making sure that that multi-focus support system is in place. There's also the element of single contact delivery. We've talked a little bit about how different agencies or processes are segregated, in that somebody might do an assessment process and another service provider might do job development and then hand it back over to do on the job training. And we get this really disjointed process. When what we've heard from feedback in these focus groups is that essentially having one person assigned all the way through, they know the client better. They can anticipate their needs better. They can speak about the client better to employers. And so having that single point of contact is really important. And then lastly, of course, always having high quality jobs, having high expectations is essential here. I also have some quotes to illustrate some of these concepts, and I also won't read them to you, though it's very tempting because it is it's good information. But the first one really taps into continual networking. So this person's saying, I feel like the pieces that's most effective or that produces the most results is probably the networking and the educating employers. And you can do that a lot of different ways. This person's really speaking to the need to get out there regularly, and build those relationships. So pouring our time and energy into getting to know the individuals that are actually in a position to hire clients in a competitive integrated employment. The second, there's a lot going on, a lot of themes tapped into here in this individual quote. Both the single contact service delivery, again, applying to significant support needs, also targeting quality jobs. But this person's essentially saying that they previously used a job developer model and it becomes about picking the easiest place or people to place in jobs instead of finding jobs that people want. And they go on to say that, essentially they were seeing the same. type of grocery store hires for everyone that was coming through the door. And so the takeaway here is it's really essentially not about quantity, it's about quality. And that takes time and a lot more effort if we're being honest. Any job is not the same as the right job. But beyond that, making sure that we're not limiting our clients just to what is kind of convenient to the service provider. We also, in addition to some of those kind of through or across phases, we looked at some more ancillary type of factors that really deeply influence quality support employment. I'm sure none of you are surprised by any of the things on this list. As Carol mentioned, we're trying to develop a fidelity scale. And so we are trying to be mindful of what should be actionable steps within each of the four phases, but then also what do we have that sort of contextually surrounds support employment that's really helping or hindering our progress. And so these really tap into that. Um, Funding, of course, everyone agrees on funding. Staffing capacity. Are we really able to meet the needs of clients in a way that is, yeah, I see all the head shakes. No, it's a huge problem, and it does affect whether or not we can provide quality support employment. If we're spread too thin, we're obviously going to have to take to cut corners, and that's an issue. Staff training. We know that the average training and experience of service providers is just it's there's I shouldn't say average, it's honestly there's a range and it's vastly different from person to person, and so we need to really think about how we can address that. Having a fidelity scale is a good step in that direction. That's part of why we're doing this research. Worker contribution. Probably this is not named the way it should be, but worker contribution in this case actually means framing the value of the worker, making sure that employers and the community, really everyone at large, knows that we are viewing these clients as value added in these scenarios. There's also a lot of confusion across models. We heard a lot about different elements of other interventions that are not supported employment being used in the context of supported employment. And we want to be cognizant of how that's happening and why, and making sure that we're parsing back out what is core to supported employment and what belongs in other intervention categories. And lastly, of course, fidelity of implementation. If we know how to close that research or practice gap, then we need to be able to create a way in order to systematically apply that intervention broadly in order to get the same research results, because we want to see those in practice. I have a few quotes to bolster, and I'll move quickly because we're getting towards the end here, but this one looks at funding. It's essentially saying that I'll read the first part. They move like molasses, meaning those approving the funding for services. They move like with this like molasses speed in terms of opening cases and getting you approved. And it's this person's going to lose their job in the next 18 hours if we don't get moving. We supply services for free because we're operating at the speed of the business and you have to. If you're going to build trust with that business, and we don't just view it as I'm keeping Bob in this job, but I'm defending the honor and integrity of the concept of support employment that I told the business on day one that we were all in this together. And now I actually need to prove that when the business says there's a problem. So the reason I read all of that is because there's a lot going on here. But essentially, what they're saying is there's a disconnect here between supporting the individual and getting services on time, and that they need to keep their word to the client, but they also need to keep their word to the business. And if they don't, what's at stake is the reputation of supported employment in general. And so we need to be careful about how damaging that can be if we have these hangups that are impacting our keeping our word. I'll go over these a little bit quickly, but here's a good example of state and federal policy. The first one's really looking at the need to show updated numbers to persuade those in a position of policy change in order to provide more support for supported employment. And then I touched on this already with the confusion across models. When What we really found from these focus groups is that when service is not tied to a direct funding source or billing code, so to speak, then there's a blending of models. There's nothing that's really holding a service provider accountable to keeping to a stringent type of actionable steps. And so there's a lot of blending that's going on with, again, those different elements of different interventions. So how do we keep the fidelity of implementation more clean? All of this points to needing a fidelity scale. And then lastly, I just want to hit on worker contribution. So this person said there's people that are doing things that are not best practices. They are still presenting people as charities, or they're presenting as people as charities still. The charity case is not a good one. It's outdated. It's not useful. It undermines the value of supported employment, and it obviously undermines the value of the workers that we're trying to support. Supported employment at its core is about creating meaningful opportunities for people with IDD and other disabilities to get competitive integrated employment. They should contribute to that business, again, in a value added way, whether it's an increase in efficiency, increase in profit, increase in productivity. There should be some tangible measurement that shows the value of them there. This is not a charity. And so kind of moving back into that idea of having that as a central framework that bolsters supported employment. And again, this culminated into this conceptual model. It is preliminary. Of course, we want to involve a lot of other stakeholders as we build this out and finalize it and move towards a fidelity scale. But you can see here that we have the four basic components really in the middle, and we need actionable implementation steps within each of those four categories, a lot more ironed out so that we can have systematic application. But then we also need to be mindful of those quality indicators that are really cutting across through all those phases, and that contextually we need to step back and make sure those are in place as we're moving through each of them. And then also those modifiable influencers that I just went over that are really helping or hindering the process as a whole. And the last slide here, I'm going to turn over to Carol and she's going to wrap it up for us.
So this last slide is just pointing to our next steps in this research. As we mentioned, this is about a fidelity scale. This is about helping the field really define what is supported employment for people with IDD. And so we are going to be seeking input from VR counselors, from job seekers with IDD, and employees with IDD to participate with us so their voices are represented in whatever we define as fidelity. And then the next phases of this research will continue on to test the scale for reliability and validity and really establish a standard. Fidelity scales help say, this is the standard. Don't just rush into, it's not the first job, it's not any job, it's the right job. And so we want to make sure as we think about fidelity with the values that we bring to this. With that, I think we have about 5 minutes or so, maybe 6 minutes for any question, comments, discussion, etc. And because we're live streaming, we're going to have the microphone brought to you. Natalie is going to be running around doing her talk show host best.
Why would you not have providers as one of the sources that you just indicated? Because in all honesty, DVR counselors deal with supported employment in the hypothetical,
Right.
not the real.
Well, this whole study, you may have missed the beginning. This was the provider study. All of the people who provided the quotes that we had throughout, they were providers of supported employment services. And so this was that we started with them first.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. That's okay. He said, thank you, everybody.
I have a question about the blended model conundrum that you talked about. Did
Yeah.
you in the focus groups ask the participants why they felt they were using models that was blending different types? And I can mostly talk, I guess, from customized employment. From what we've heard, it's because people on the ground feel like even with fidelity skills, the things that are created there, kind of that you hit at the beginning, aren't necessarily applicable to the real world scenario. So I'm curious, other than kind of the bigger problems with it, did you get any insight as to why program managers and employment specialists felt like they were using models that crossed several different designs?
Yeah. Will both be
I
on
mean,
camera.
honestly, there's a lack of understanding of what the differences are between the models and who would be a good candidate for which. And so really what that comes down to is that it's not a mindful choice about which to use. It's confusion about the differences between them. Discovery, for example, is a big component of customized employment, and that sort of bled into all of the other intervention types. But it's a very specific type of information gathering, and it's reserved for a very specific candidate and not necessary really for everyone. And so part of what we hope to do with this fidelity scale is not only identify what is a component of CE, but like what is not a necessary, I'm sorry, SE.
Yes.
Now you got me saying it, but what is not a necessary component? And so hopefully we can get a greater distinction between those models to help guide service providers.
I think there's one more point there, and it tied in with one of those early comments about the efficiency of assessment. Discovery is not just a process that's saved for those with the most significant disabilities. It's also a time-intensive process. And if we're using discovery for everyone, and we could move into job development sooner. We're actually, ethically withholding resources from people who might need it. A job is a really important part of a person's life. We all self-define by our jobs. Meeting new people, one of the first things we ask is, what do you do? And we don't mean for fun. So I think that becomes important. There's another question. Oh, before we go to you, there's a Zoom question. Yes.
Yes, someone online is asking, once there is a fidelity scale, who would do the fidelity reviews?
That's a really good question. Our partner in this research is APSI. And whether or not this would be adopted by RSA, we don't know. But this could be kind of a seal of what's the word I'm looking for? Like a quality seal, like the Council on Quality Services, or just like, hey, we are following a particular model. We meet a particular fidelity standard would be an answer. And so we're working with APSI both from a recruiting perspective, but also once we develop a scale and we're out there testing it, we're going to be working with APSI folks to like test it out with us. Is there another? Oh, there's a question in the back. Natalie is doing a beautiful job. Thank you.
To kind of piggyback on the question just about discovery, in Colorado, we have found that like discovery can be used almost as like that first step, but then once they go through discovery, it might be determined that just general supported employment is what's most appropriate for them. Would that ever be kind of considered with this?
Well, so what we would call that is probably something different, just to differentiate it, because we do have to really be mindful about when do we put the whole process of CE, so customized employment, into effect? And from a resources perspective, when do we say, oh, supported employment is right here? What are those decision points? That's still stuff we have to figure out. But to your question more directly, we're beginning to think in terms of this job seeker profile, that kind of person-centered view. We know we're somewhere in between, like a person who maybe has had a physical impact or an impairment related to a traumatic brain injury, who comes in and says, I used to do that, now I want to do this. So your assessment or your profile piece really is a 2-hour interview, and you're off and running in job development, versus the person who comes in and maybe has very significant impairment in many, many ways. And you really do have to customize a job. There is no job. Off the shelf job is actually one of the terms that our participants use. There is no off the shelf job or array of tasks that this person can do. I have to make it up. And so understanding the difference that we're in between there. We're in between 2 hours and I'm looking for a job versus it's going to take me a month or so to really learn you and learn what works best for you. And so that's really why we think it's important to get some clarification between those two. Does that help?
It does, yeah. Just last question. Do you have a timeline for when you hope to have this rolled out?
Well, we're going to do those next two ups. Let me go. I'm going the wrong way. We're going to do the VR counselors and the job seekers and employees focus groups, and then we're going to test this out. So we're in a 5-year process. In terms of testing it out, though, we will be looking for agencies who want to participate in the research, and we're going to look at this from an agency. Oh, we're at time. Thank you. Last sentence. We're going to look at this from an agency perspective. So the agency, not the individual service provider, will be the one that we look at. And so is the agency training their job coaches in both sets of skills, et cetera. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon on a cold and rainy Wisconsin afternoon. Thank you all of you who joined us by distance. We really appreciate your time.